Hey guys, so I've got a couple disclaimers before this video gets on. This was something I made last year and intended to finish and drop in August, so some of the information is outdated and whatnot. And the original intention was to do the entire Multiverse Saga in this video, but I found my will to make videos slowly decrease over the end of last year and I just haven't picked this project back up. I may in the future, but in the case I don't, I figured I would share with you what I made so far so at least it's out there. The video will end a bit abruptly because, as I said, this was meant to be longer, but here we are. We'll be covering everything from WandaVision to Moon Knight. I do have a segment written for Multiverse of Madness that never got recorded, but we'll see if it does someday. But regardless of all of that, I hope you enjoy. Here's the video. So it's been no small secret that I'm a bit of a cape shit hater. I've mentioned many times how little the MCU matters to me in the current state. Ever since Endgame, I have very much fell off watching this stuff. I've only caught a few projects because the lack of quality became obvious. I've said many times that I don't actually think superhero fatigue is a real thing. I think people were just burned out with the MCU's consistent lack of quality. People still show up to quality cape stuff like recently Guardians 3, Across the Spider-Verse and Superman even this year. They've all been very commercially successful and adored movies. The MCU just hasn't been able to keep up the quality they had in the Infinity Saga, and this is due to a huge lack of planning, prep and creative freedom. Everything has been so rushed and sloppily thrown together and controlled by the Hat Man that it's killed off many of their fans, including me. I grew up loving comic books. I grew up loving the MCU. I was 7 when Iron Man came out. I was primed for the MCU, and I saw many of them opening day like Homecoming, Black Panther, Infinity War. Man, I saw Endgame twice. I loved those movies. I loved those characters, and though they're often much different to their comic counterparts, like Thor being jokey, Guardians being interesting, and Iron Man being good, I was still on board. But like I said, the lack of quality and the non-stop slot machine pumping out mediocre quality projects really killed my enjoyment for the franchise, and I was pretty done with the MCU. That was until recently when I saw the Fantastic Four First Steps, which I did a video once ago and watched that, and I started reading more Marvel comics again. Not necessarily because I thought the movie was fantastic, but it just reminded me how much I loved the Fantastic Four comics growing up, so I broke out all of my old comics, I opened the boxes, and I started reading again. And it tempted me to get back into the MCU and back into the Multiverse Saga and really give it a go this time, watch it all, even the shit I've already seen, and talk about my thoughts to you guys. And if you'd like an Infinity Saga video in the same vein as this one, let me know because I am more than happy to do that. But this was uncharted territory. I had not seen much of the Multiverse Saga, and what I did see I wasn't massively impressed by, but the slot machine was calling me. Naturally, I will not be talking about a lot of things considered a part of this saga like What If, I Am Groot and all those weird other bits. And I know the Multiverse Saga isn't over yet, I just thought that now we're creeping closer to the mess that is Avengers Doomsday and filming of the new Spider-Man is underway. Now is a great time to really dive into where we're at and where we have to go to really make the finale of this saga redeem itself. Now of course the Multiverse Saga begins with WandaVision, which is so weird to me because it should be Far From Home. It is so jarring that the Infinity Saga ends with that and not Endgame, but whatever. Now to quickly point out something before diving into this show, this is the beginning of one of the core issues of the MCU. TV shows. Since the MCU started doing TV shows, everything became stuffed. Before we'd get a few movies a year, and now we get a few movies and multiple TV shows, and all of it is necessary. It became very hard to keep up and stomach everything, and that starts with the success of WandaVision because this show was a hit. It was being released weekly, so it had the internet theories going crazy. I remember there being a whole Mephisto theory that went nowhere, and it's so funny looking back on how crazy people's theories were compared to what we actually got, but it was cool seeing everyone so invested in the same thing. But what did I think overall? Well, I just read through the House of M comic series, which this show is loosely loosely based on, and it's kind of ridiculous how much better that comic run is. It's kind of like how they really reduced the issues in Civil War in the movie because they just didn't have the foundations of the comic universe to really make that story work as well as it could. It's a similar situation here, like the mutants and the X-Men are super important to the House of M story, and the overall story there is that Wanda is becoming a big problem after losing control of her powers and killing some of the Avengers. So the Avengers, X-Men and the Fantastic Four, the mutants, all of that, they all come together to decide whether to kill her or not. They choose to do so and they show up to do it, and Wanda basically puts them all into a different universe. She fundamentally changes the world to one where everyone gets what they want. The catch being that none of them know this is actually what's taken place, with the exception of Wolverine because it just didn't work on him and a little girl. It's such an interesting run involving all the big players in the Marvel universe. It essentially ends with Wanda deciding to go sicko mode and destroying the X gene, taking away nearly every mutant's abilities across the globe. It's a story that has incredible stakes and consequences in the comics universe, and in comparison, this show feels incredibly small and inconsequential. And I didn't expect an adaptation of the comic, it's not really trying to be, but it takes heavy inspiration from it and it doesn't even translate the stakes well. Like, she takes over a little town, though you don't know that till halfway through the show, and the finale really doesn't change much in the MCU as a whole, but we'll get there. To start with some positive things, I think Elizabeth Olsen is brilliant in this show. She's a brilliant Wanda Maximoff who fulfills every aspect of the character so well, and this is easily her best performance as Wanda. Paul Bettany is also pretty great in this too. We introduce Catherine Hahn as Agatha Harkness, who is easily my favourite part of this show, and when thinking of the early episodes, I think it actually operates very well. The whimsical retro nature of the show is really cute, the aesthetics really commit, the performances are all equally committed, the writing is super witty and funny, and the small cracks in the built reality are very intriguing, even on a rewatch. Honestly, everything good about this show can be found in the first episode. It's quite frankly a perfect episode of TV, an incredibly well-crafted piece of drama. It's all directed by Matt Shakman, who was responsible for the latest Fantastic Four movie, and I can honestly say the first episode is by far his best work ever. It's a shame the rest of the show isn't quite as good as this first episode. Now don't get me wrong, the first episode isn't the only good episode. I think it's just a slow descent into harsh mediocrity. The second episode is still very good. Vision does a magic show, and the idea is that he has gum in his machinery, causing him to act kind of drunk, and Bettany puts on a brilliant performance that is super reminiscent of like Rick Mile, and it's probably his best moment in the entire show.
No, abracadabra!
And the third has some of the show's best moments, with it being the episode where Wanda gets pregnant and gives birth. But episode 4 is where all the cracks start to show. It's a big info dump episode where we then basically explain a lot of the mystery in totality, rather than having the whole show be a mystery that slowly revealed pieces of the puzzle. There's still some mysteries to be had, but this episode dispels a bunch of that magic that the first 3 episodes build, and the following episodes pretty much lose it altogether. I will say the reintroduction of Kat Dennings as Darcy is fun. She was kind of a drag in her previous appearances in the Thor movies, but she's pleasantly funny in this show. But she's an exception because in general, the wider the cast gets, the worse it gets, which I think peaks with the hilarious casting of Evan Peters as Pietro, which everyone, and I mean everyone, was going nuts and theorizing about this casting, but they revealed that it kind of just means nothing and it was pure stunt casting. I have no idea why they chose to do a bait and switch like that. It adds no value to the show and only serves to put a sour taste in the audience's mouth. You know, there's this really funny and damning moment where Vision throws off the Halloween costume because he has to get serious, but he takes off this bright and colourful comic accurate-ish costume to reveal the ugly sludge colored MCU costume and unintentionally really calls itself out on its costume design. You know, the whole episode they'd be going, oh look how silly and dumb these costumes are, but then when they take them off it makes their actual costumes look really awful. Also, I found on my latest rewatch that there's whole chunks of the episodes that take place after the credits, which is just insane to me. I completely forgot about this, because these chunks are not unnecessary fan service or a cute add-on, it's necessary content that should be in the actual episodes. It wasn't until I was watching the finale and during the previously on section did I realise I missed a whole bunch of scenes. I looked back and I hadn't missed any episodes, they just threw a whole bunch of stuff during the mid-credits. I can't even imagine the amount of people who missed that stuff and went into the final episode completely confused as I nearly did. The button to switch to the next episode even pops up before these scenes. But other than all that, I don't have a whole lot to say on the rest of the show. The skipping error stuff is cute, seeing the sitcom styles change along with the catchy intros is super endearing. They commit very strongly to each style and I think it really works. The Agatha All Along song is still very catchy and that reveal is still great, but I do find it funny how that song was such a hit on TikTok and social media that it tricked Marvel into making a whole Agatha show that nobody watched, but also it didn't come out for 3 years. Great job with striking while the iron was hot, you fucking idiots. But I think the overall failing of the show is that it started out as something very unique, something everyone loved and was invested in, and then it just turned into something very boring and, well, MCU-y. We get a big CGI battle in the end, everyone gets wrapped up very quickly, the effects of the show's events aren't even really discussed afterwards, a lot of it doesn't piece together that well, and some of the show really falls apart under the lightest bits of scrutiny. Also, I didn't even write this down, but just real quick. In the end, when Agatha and Wanda are fighting, they are witches and they are using magic, so why do they just always resort to shooting the purple laser and the red laser at each other? Use some spells, man. I also think there's a big missed opportunity to see how the town of Westview have attempted to recover and really assess the damage. Some of these people on the edge of town have just been kept in stasis, pure set dressing, not even extras, but we never get to see the effects of that, which I would imagine are monumental. I do like the resolution to the Vision fight, relaying the Ship of Theseus problem and using that to bring Vision back to the MCU, which I think is quite clever. And really, if they stayed consistent with the quality of the first 3 or so episodes that's occasionally blotted in the other episodes, this really could have been a knockout, undeniable hit for Marvel, and when it centers around Wanda and her reality, her pain, the show soars, but as it stands, I think it's a mediocre presentation of missed potential.
No, you didn't.
So I do think it's very odd and bold they decided to kick off Phase 4 and the Multiverse Saga with 3 TV shows back to back. It's kind of a lot, but with WandaVision being an interesting kickoff that people did seem to like. How did the Falcon and the Winter Soldier go? Well, being honest, I didn't see this one on release because I really didn't care at all. I've never found Falcon that interesting in either comic form or in the previous movies, nor have I ever really found Bucky strong enough to hold the protagonist role, and everything I heard of this show was that it was middling at best, it was boring, so I just skipped it. Also, by the end of Endgame, Falcon had taken on the mantle of Captain America, and from what I know, this show was just him learning to take up the mantle of Captain America, which seems like a big, unnecessary roundabout way to set a new status quo that was already the status quo before the show's existence, but whatever the show. So this attempts to make Sam Wilson a compelling character, because with the exclusion of his introduction in Winter Soldier, he really hasn't been. He's had a few cute moments like his Spider-Man fight in Civil War, but he's an overall uninteresting character in the franchise, and I think the show easily does the best at developing Sam. But it isn't perfect. I think opening the show on a big action scene rather than a quiet character moment is a very poor choice. I just think it sets the wrong tone for the show, because this is is a show about Sam learning to be Captain America and what that actually means. What the difference is between the Falcon and being Captain America, and most of that journey isn't about the action but about the character's development. And opening on a big action sequence doesn't really sell that. They really should have opened the show on the museum scene. I think it sets the tone for the show and Sam's arc much better. And I think that's only more pronounced in the way that they introduce Bucky into the show, because they introduce him in a very great scene. We get this dream flashback to when he was a straight villain, and then we bleed that into a therapy session where he's dealing with his PTSD. It's a perfect introduction to his character in the present and the development he's going to be going through. A few things I do like. I love the idea of Sam giving up the shield just for the government to appoint their own Captain America. Considering Steve Rogers' views on the Sokovia Accords and his outspoken views on not being a representative of government but good, makes this choice especially egregious. It's a very compelling idea. I also love how they present that John Walker also just sucks at being Captain America. He's a pretty good soldier, but every time he says he's Captain America, every time he shows up to a fight, I just don't believe him. I think it really speaks to how well the Infinity Saga built the mythos of Captain America and what that name means. The aura that Steve Rogers carried with it, he could do this all day. He fought odds you wouldn't believe, was willing to go a distance no man could possibly go. And so we associate those ideas, that attitude, with the shield. And John Walker just doesn't embody any of it. He's always smugly swanning around, taking selfies and taking ass beatings and giving up so easily after. And it isn't just us, the characters in the universe feel it too. They even have this very clear idea where Zemo asks Sam whether he'd take the serum, and he says no without hesitation, whereas John contemplates it heavily when he has the chance and ultimately takes it. I also like how we don't see him take it but see through his feats of strength that he has. It's a simple way to show the very plain differences between Sam Wilson and John Walker. Those who want the serum should never be given it. It should be a burden placed on the worthy, not handed to the power hungry. Obviously this all culminates to the scene later in the show where he brutally smashes a man's skull in out of pure vengeance, which is just so anti-Captain America. And of course it isn't the killing explicitly. Steve Rogers never shied away from killing people either, but it was always when necessary and it was never with excessive means. If Cap was going to kill anyone, even Thanos, it would be quick and swift and a last resort. Also, the constant shots of the bloodstained shield is so awesome. It's incredibly powerful imagery. What's interesting about John Walker though is that they briefly talk about what John did in Afghanistan and what he had to do to accomplish his missions, and in the end he was given medals of honor for that work. He struggles with that pull, but in the end he believes it was his duty. It was what he was trained to do, trained to be. So when he became Captain America and exercised that same brutality, he expected to be treated in a similar fashion, maybe even rewarded. But the reason that soldiers can commit those crimes in foreign countries is because we don't see it. There's no outrage because it's silenced. Whereas Cap here is now on a global stage. There's a part during his court hearing where he says that he is Captain America, and I think that's him saying that everything he did that he's been reprimanded for by now is exactly what America trained him to be. He is everything America represents in those countries, which I find an interesting position for the show to take. Also, he comes round in the end to aid in some ways, equipped with a steel shield and all, and though his efforts are futile, the point is that he isn't an evil guy. He's just not Captain America. He has very human flaws which Captain America can't afford to have. I also love how the show tackles prejudice with the ideas of Isaiah being a super soldier in the modern day, decades before Captain America was frozen out, and Sam getting stopped by the police and only let go after they realise he's Falcon. Not to mention how the government tells Sam that giving up the shield for the museum was the right decision, only for them to give it to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed true American, which is in their eyes a much more suiting face for the moniker. It's also culturally relevant in real life because of how many awful hardcore fans of these movies reacted to Anthony Mackie taking over the role of Captain America. I love how we visit Wakanda in this show, even if it is only for a few minutes. They bring back the drums associated with the soundtrack of Black Panther, which is a nice touch. And I've always just found the idea of Bucky being the national white boy of Wakanda so funny.
You are freaking African Americans plus Mark. You know what I'm saying? Which I'm rocking with Mark because Mark is rocking with us.
But they used this whole thread to reintroduce the Dora Milaje and Wakanda's issue with Zemo being back in the streets. They have a great action scene with a whoop on Captain America, and it sells their power very well, whilst also in the end giving Zemo a very somber resolution. The show just weaves a lot of narratives and ideas very well, whilst also tying up a lot of old loose ends like Zemo and Sharon Carter. I also find it hilarious how Zemo employs the Narnia tactic of getting kids to sell out their loved ones for Turkish delight. There's also a great deal of interesting commentary on how the Avengers and superheroes aren't really paid, and Sam's never made a real living from being an Avenger. I think Anthony Mackie and Sebastian Stan also have great chemistry that really comes through, and not just the quippy dialogue, but their intense and dramatic scenes. When it's just them two talking and processing their feelings on this sensitive subject, the show is at its best. I honestly wish it was just a show about that, but I suppose nobody except me would watch that, so we get this part action series with poorly written villains with unclear motivations like every other MCU project. And for real, we understand they preferred life after everyone disappeared, but it's all very blurry on what they're actually seeking to accomplish for pretty much the entire show. And when it's difficult to understand the antagonist's goals, it's hard to be invested as an audience in seeing them stopped. Honestly, the worst episode is the final episode, where they do indulge in some very heavy MCU shenanigans, and it's all centered around Carly and the Flag Smashers. There's some ugly action sequences, and it really is a poor end for an overall great show. But I like that in the end, Sam isn't Captain America because the government deemed him so. He's not even Captain America because Steve chose him to be. He's Captain America because he chose to be. Honestly, what's more surprising is how much I actually like this show. I didn't expect it, but the drama is handled very well. The stories being told are very mature and are handled maturely. None of the tension and maturity is undercut by dumb quippy dialogue. The villain arc that John Walker goes through is actually compelling and well done. The show succeeds in making me care about Sam's journey to becoming Captain America and makes me proud that he is Captain America. And it handles Bucky's fight with his PTSD very sensitively. Apart from the subpar villains and the Flag Smashers and Carly, I'm really taken aback by how much I got into this. I'm just as shocked as anyone, but I think this might be one of the better things in the Multiverse Saga. So we're moving on to Loki, and I did watch the first season of this when it came out, and that's all we're going to be discussing for now. We're going to discuss season 2 when we get to it in release order later on. But for season 1, I didn't really remember much. I remember it introducing us to Kang, played by Jonathan Majors, who was wonderful in the role regardless of his real life proclivities and legal troubles I won't be getting into. I remember enjoying the show quite a bit. The TVA angle was nice. I enjoy a lot of the aesthetic choices, the performances were all great, and I had no major complaints. I did think diegetically the Loki of the show shouldn't be how he is really, meaning he seems to have fast traveled through all the character development he went through from the Avengers all the way to Infinity War. They cram all of that development into the first episode, and I understand why. They need Loki at the point where we all love him so we can get on with the story, but it does feel a bit cheap. But it wasn't a huge complaint, it didn't distract me a whole lot. I just think the little stuff matters sometimes. But how did I feel a second time round? That is still an issue for me, but like the first time, it isn't the biggest issue in the world, and when put next to the positives of the season, I can overlook it mostly. And what are the positives? Of course, Tom Hiddleston is fantastic as Loki. He always has been, but this is also easily the best he is as the character. The writing for him is so witty, but Hiddleston is so playful and so charismatic with the writing, the dialogue especially, and he gives off such an infectious performance. He really draws you in with with every line reading. I also think he's obviously having a brilliant time doing it all. He seems so excited to be playing this character again, and he is just bathing in the role, every emotion from gloom to glee. And I love the world he finds himself in. The TVA aesthetic is super cute, and I love the retro futuristic style with the autumnal colour palette. The warm yellows, oranges and browns are soaking the frame in almost all the scenes, and they give the show its own identity away from all other MCU projects. I also think it's quite impressive how this show bears the weight of this entire saga, in that it has to explain to the audience the entire multiversal concept and how it actually works. We learn about Nexus events and the history of the multiverse, the TVA and all the inner workings, and it explains it all flawlessly. And though Hiddleston is brilliant as Loki, Owen Wilson as Mobius is the shining star at the center of this solar system. He's giving a wonderful performance, and I don't think the show works at all without his charm. It's not the best performance in the show, but it's very, very notable. I also think the final twist of He Who Remains running the whole thing and the cliffhanger the show ends on is a very great hook. It perfectly sets up Kang as the new big bad, and his power seems terrifying when looking at the scale of it and thinking about its reach. I'm not going to get into what they do later on with this character because, you know, we'll get there when we get there, but I do think this show presents him as an interesting new big bad that definitely could rival Thanos. And Feige recently turning around now to say they never planned on having Kang as the big bad is fair, but also ridiculous. Fair because I don't think they planned much ahead at all, so I do think their venture into the new saga may have left their new big bad undecided for a big portion, but ridiculous because I think by the time the show had concluded and Ant-Man had started production, they had definitely landed on Kang being the new overall villain of the MCU. And it makes sense, Thanos is a mad titan for sure, but Kang is a true multiversal threat. He's a significant player in the comics, and I definitely think if done well, could have been a greater foe for this universe to tackle. Feige just became chicken shit because of the Jonathan Majors legal situation and the response to Ant-Man. But again, this will be all discussed later on. But specifically in this show, I think Jonathan Majors pulls off the little screen time he's awarded and gives the best performance in a single scene. Hiddleston is of course giving the best overall performance, but when contained to one scene, it's hard to argue against Majors during his big reveal. He's a very capable performer who brings a sense of theatrics to his performance here. He's menacing in a fun and pantomime way, stark contrast to Thanos, who was menacing in a very dark and gloomy and overbearing way, which I think also makes him work very well as Thanos' replacement. It's as if Majors is on a stage when everyone else is on a set. And I think it really speaks to how well particular actors can perform when given the right material to work with. The writing on this show, particularly the dialogue, is so fruitful and the actors are clearly having a blast performing it. It's a shame this level of writing can't be maintained outside of this show, because if it were, I think the MCU would probably be in its strongest era right now. But in the end, what might surprise you is that despite this being the show with the most across-the-board love, I have an incredible little to say about this one. Everything I said applies pretty much to every episode. It is consistent across the whole show. I could talk about how the intro goes hard, the multiple Lokis is a fun idea, and the cosmic adventure feels vast and fun, but it's stuff we all know and it's honestly quite boring to talk about. It is a good show, but I think I like it a little less than the Falcon show because I think that show has higher peaks and takes more interesting swings. But I do think Loki is more technically proficient with what it's trying to accomplish, and I can see why this is the darling of Phase 4. And finally we get out of the TV show run for a while. We can finally get to some movies. Great. So what do we get to start with? Ah, shit. Okay, so I have seen Black Widow before, and yeah, I didn't like it. It was unfunny, ugly, and about 5 years too late. It's a movie set during Civil War, and though prequels aren't that much of an issue, a few of the Infinity Saga movies were prequels, but what's so jarring about this one is that the events all take place during Civil War, not before or after, I mean specifically during Civil War. And not only that, we follow a character we have already happy, mourn. So the entire film feels tedious because we know the outcome and the stakes feel null. It just feels like a film they planned to make beforehand, never got round to, and have reworked to introduce some new characters they want to be major players later on, like Yelena and Red Guardian. When really, what they should have done is just make the movie center around those characters specifically and not make it a movie about Natasha. Maybe make it a movie mourning Natasha and how this pretend family is reeling over her death, but to actually include her feels incredibly messy. The reason why something like Loki works, though Loki is dead and mourned by the audience, is that the show is a prequel but also technically a sequel show. It takes place kind of out of time and it takes the character out of an expected path and into completely new territory for the MCU. And being fair, a Natasha prequel could have worked even with all the drawbacks of its concept, but the movie they created with those limitations isn't anywhere near inventive or competent enough to make them irrelevant. But on a revisit, let's see if any of these issues have subsided. So I already told you what I think the circumstances around this film's inception were, but what the film is telling you its purpose is to fill in some of the fogged backstory of Natasha Romanoff. Now I already have some issues with that just conceptually, because I think part of the fun of Black Widow's character is that a lot of her history is clouded in mystery. This is just unnecessarily showing us what's behind the curtain, and it certainly does ruin much of the magic. Like, I don't want to actually know more about what happened in Budapest. So much joy of that original joke is not knowing. Anyway, the most haunting thing in Natasha's backstory that we learn in this movie is that she's originally from Ohio. I admittedly really like the introduction of Yelena in the story. I think she's the most complicated character in the movie and played by the best actor in the cast. Pugh is very charismatic and pulls off some of the cornier jokes that really shouldn't work, and not only does she bring a more light-hearted and infectious energy to the film's glum and bland atmosphere, she also brings so much of the heart. Because essentially Natasha and Yelena were two abandoned kids, a part of a fake family, but to Yelena she was so young that the family felt real whilst Natasha knew better. Yelena is really troubled about not having a real family. The only person she has is Natasha, who she never sees. Natasha would have similar issues, but she found Clint and S.H.I.E.L.D., then eventually the Avengers. She has found family, whilst Yelena has been left abandoned all these years. Seeing Yelena in this movie is like seeing how badly it could have gone for Natasha, also if Natasha was a little bit more charismatic. And that's the thing with Natasha in this movie also, she has little to no characterization. This is why I feel this was an old script resurrected to bring these other characters in, because Natasha is the only one who doesn't really go through an arc, whereas Yelena goes through one, hell, even Alexei goes through one, but Natasha is the same character from the start of the movie to the end of it. And it also doesn't change anything that happens in universe after the film's events. Well, that's not exactly true. Natasha becomes practically invincible in this movie, so that's new, I suppose. And I mean, really, she should have died like multiple times in this movie, but she comes out completely unscathed from some of the craziest stuff. Look at this. This is the kind of shit that would knock Cap off his ass, but for some reason Black Widow is just like fine. And Taskmaster is completely underutilized in this movie. I personally don't care that she's a woman in this adaptation, since the gender of Taskmaster doesn't impact their character, but what does is them not having a personality, a speaking role, or resemble anything like the character in the comics. I'm all for changing things from the comics. I've praised many adaptations for doing so, even in this video, but the changes need to work, and when you take a character as interesting and fun as Taskmaster and turn them into whatever this is, it really hollows out all the coolness. And talking of complete lack of coolness, David Harbour is so weird in this movie. His character is consistently caught between goofball, tough guy, and regretful father. He's someone who always wanted to be a hero but just never ended up having the circumstances to allow it, and that all sounds like it makes for a compelling character, but I think the writing is just simply weak and Harbour's performance never manages to blend those personalities well. I don't think he's a bad actor, but I just think the film doesn't know its own tone sometimes, and I think he may have had just a big lack of direction on set, because each personality in a vacuum kind of works, but it's when they're all in tandem it falls apart and makes for a messy character. Not to mention his Russian accent is frankly offensive, and I'm not even Russian. It's a pure caricature of an 80s Russian villain. Rachel Weisz's Russian accent also also absolutely sucks. It's not as over the top goofy as Harbor's, she is actually trying, but it still isn't very good. Neither is the aesthetic of this movie. The look of this thing is gross. Every action scene is littered with some of the most offensive green screening I have ever seen in a movie. The action scenes are not very well choreographed for the most part, and this is easily one of the most bland movies in the MCU across all areas. The accents are mostly bad, the sets are boring, the villain is dumb, the visual effects are ugly, the story is largely uncompelling and has no stakes, it's too long, it's overstuffed but also somehow lacking in any kind of substance outside of Yelena. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen, it does some things just well enough to be passable, and like I said, Pugh sells her character with complete conviction, but otherwise, the film feels subpar, even for the MCU. It's a shame this movie is how it is, but it does introduce us to Yelena, and that's something I can look forward to in the following movies. However, we got some other shit to deal with first. Because right now we gotta move over to Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This was one I watched in the background partially once. I remember finding what I did see pretty uneventful, and I distinctly remember the third act looking egregiously ugly. But in my time on the internet, a lot of people have said that this is one of the good entries, and that has honestly made me curious. I think one of my problems inherent with this movie's existence is how it kind of makes previous movies make less sense. This becomes an issue with more things later on, but just the existence of the Ten Rings and this whole side of the MCU kind of breaks Infinity War and Endgame and Doctor Strange and all of that stuff. Because where exactly were you during that time? If you're telling me that these people existed at that time, their absence makes no sense in those earlier events. Or even just that their existence has not been mentioned until now. Obviously the Ten Rings were, but kind of just this entire side with the actual Ten Rings doesn't make sense. Wong even shows up at the end of the movie to talk about the rings and how they've never been noted before, but that just doesn't compute to me. The Sanctum Sanctorum and the Sorcerer Supreme should have knowledge of all of these things. The Ten Rings in these adaptations are practically magical artifacts, and they practice actual magic martial arts, and yet the President of Magic doesn't know about it? The Sorcerer Supreme is genuinely so important, and I hate to constantly bring up comics as evidence for things, but if the MCU Sorcerer Supreme is anywhere near as powerful or important to Earth as any comic version of this character, there's basically no chance they would not have known about this. There's a whole magic village with magic dragons, and the Prime Minister of Magic Tricks just has no clue. And having Wong come in at the end to just basically say, ooh, we need to investigate why we've never heard about this for the past 1,000 years is so goofy. And it isn't a clean way to brush it under the rug. It's just incredibly iffy to me, and though this isn't the worst case of this in the Multiverse Saga, I definitely think it's worth a mention. But going into this with a fresh mind and a cleansed palate, I had to say I was slightly excited. Maybe it was due to just seeing Black Widow and I needed something to bring me up, but I was optimistic. But there are issues, and my first issue is the goddamn green screen and CG. Everyone gets on Black Widow's ass about this, saying how bad the effects and the green screen / blue screen or whatever screen is, but this movie is genuinely just as bad, if not worse. Nearly every scene with green screen is so awful and janky, and it's not just in one or two scenes, it's from beginning to end. And speaking of the end, the third act of this movie is so egregious to look at. It actually might be the ugliest thing in the MCU. Look at this dusty, brown and clearly CG blue screen ass set for the big fight. It's a tragedy because this third act should be so insanely cool. The best thing about this movie is the choreography. Every fight scene has genuinely sick martial arts choreography, and it's usually enough to make you forget how terribly it's being directed or how bad the visuals are, but those aspects are just impossible to ignore in this third act. But hey, it's not all ugly. This fight between Shang-Chi's parents during their first meeting is brilliant. I absolutely love wuxia movies, and for this movie to indulge in a lot of that style for some of the fight scenes is very exciting for me. But it honestly doesn't get any better than this first time. I actually think it's kind of fucked up for this to be the first real fight scene in the movie, because they peak so incredibly early and the movie literally never never gets better than this scene. And there is some genuinely stunning VFX work too, but this stuff honestly makes the bad stuff worse because it proves to me that the people behind this movie are competent and able to craft visually interesting fights and aesthetics. But due to the Marvel machine, everything is so rushed and done under pressure that we get so much subpar results from genuinely talented people. But that fight scene isn't the only good thing in the movie, obviously. I like they actually speak Mandarin Chinese for a fair portion of the movie. Usually the MCU doesn't make these kinds of efforts. Hell, Wanda even loses her accent after one movie in this universe, so I didn't expect that kind of consideration, but it's cool. They also bring back my favourite extra in the whole of cinema is Zach Cherry, who plays this guy who's in Spider-Man Homecoming for one of my favourite Spider-Man moments ever. I think Liu is a decently cast Shang-Chi. I've never been super into the comic character, but from what I've experienced and read, Liu does encapsulate a lot of it pretty well, and the cast overall is pretty well chosen. But there is some bad stuff still. All the visual and effects work I've mentioned, the very poor third act, and Awkwafina. And look, I don't want to jump on the Awkwafina hate train because I think she is very overhated, and granted she is bearable in this, but man, a lot of her comedy dialogue is not funny at all. And to be fair, a lot of it isn't her fault. The writing isn't amazing, but her delivery could have saved a few of these jokes, but it just doesn't. But I will say, when her role isn't about being comedic but about being dramatic, it really works, and her chemistry with Simu is great, and I like how their characters are not romantically involved. They're a very close platonic friendship. But when put into the wider context of the movie, I don't think her bad line deliveries really matter nearly as much as its other problems. It's not an awful movie by any measure, I just don't think it's very good either. It consistently undercuts tension with jokes, the green screen is offensive, the story is fine, the world building is cute, and they redeem the idea of the 10 Rings very well from its goofy origins in Iron Man 3, but it's nothing too impactful in general. There's a fairly big cast and half of them are not necessary for this story, and I feel like this movie has largely been forgotten about in the wider context of the universe. But this brings around another problem with this saga you start to feel around this movie. If you look at phase 1, 2 or 3, every single entry was a necessary entry to lead up to something, so every film felt it had a purpose. And it happened often enough that everything felt fresh. Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, Cap all lead to the Avengers. Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Guardians, Black Panther and all of that, they lead to Infinity War and blah 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 blah. But the Multiverse Saga has just been a constant stream of projects with no end result. It's like 30 or so projects so far with nothing to tie any of them together properly, and by the time we get to the next Avengers movie, people are going to have forgotten about half of this shit. Because there is so much and no real way to segment it up. Yeah, they have phases, but the phases don't actually mean anything, they're just more like a collection of movies rather than individual phases. In the Infinity Saga, every phase had a unique feel because of this exact reason, and I think it actively harms the rewatchability of this saga because let's be real, the Infinity Saga had a lot of mediocre projects, even bad ones, but you were willing to sit through them time and time again because a few movies later you'd be rewarded with an awesome team-up movie. It was real ape-brain stuff and it was great, but here, now, it feels like you're just watching a bunch of mediocre projects over and over again with no real benefit or any of them having any purpose. It makes it a real chore to watch through it all. It's like you pick up a character, play with them for a few hours and then put them down and forget about them completely as you pick up another. It just feels tedious and wasteful in the end. But alas, this is the journey we're on, so what's next? Right, so we move to Eternals, the third movie of the Multiverse Saga, and let me tell you, it's not getting any better. And look man, in the comics, the Eternals are super important, and I get they couldn't get into that until now, and that's understandable. I get it, it might have been a bit too much for the audience until now, but if now is the time you feel like you can, you have to do better than this. So yes, I had seen this one upon release, I still hadn't fully checked out of the MCU, but this was one of the final straws. was. Because when looking back at the Jack Kirby artwork for the Eternals, it was some of the most bold and acid-induced work in a career of bold and acid-induced work. I actually find the Eternals very boring in comic form, so in some ways I felt this movie was a fair adaptation, but the one thing I could always depend on the Eternals for, especially in the Kirby run, is the colour and style. And when this movie came out and I watched it on Disney Plus, which I should just quickly add here was the case for basically every project in the saga that I did see, I was incredibly underwhelmed by the visuals and at the same time so cooked by the bloated runtime filled with absolute waffle. I thought this movie was so dull, but more importantly far too indulgent for such little payoff. I was very much dreading returning to this one, even more so than something I think is actually worse like Black Widow. Because I'll take a shitty movie that's funny to laugh at that occasionally has sincerely good moments than watch a perfectly average movie that does everything just okay enough to pass the entire time. But I did it, so what do I feel now 4 years later? Well, my first and main issue is actually an in-universe problem, which is just the existence of the Eternals is problematic. Like I just mentioned this in the Shang-Chi section, but it is so much worse here because, like I said, the Eternals are super important and not to mention uber powerful. And they very much did exist during the times of Infinity War and Endgame, so where the fuck were they? They try to explain it away in this movie as it being a human problem and they don't involve themselves generally with human affairs, but like, this is not a good excuse. That is not the get out of jail free card you think it is. Thanos and that whole issue was a universal problem. He was wiping out half of the universe. He was committing mass genocide across the entire plane of existence, which includes the Eternals everywhere. It was not a human conflict or an Earth issue, and I really hate how they tried to explain it away in this movie, and this further proves my point that if they wanted to continue the MCU after Endgame, they should have just done a hard reset and rebooted it from the beginning. That way we have a clean slate for the Eternals and mutants and Shang-Chi and all of those folks to come in and it not be problematic. But anyway, we continue. I gotta say off the bat, this cast is absolutely nuts. They got Rob Stark in here, Paperboy, Sabrina Carpenter's ex, Mrs. Smith, Jon Snow, the creator, and Harry Styles. And they're all pretty good. I think the characters are handled very poorly, but the actors are doing a decent enough job with them. And by the characters are handled poorly, I just mean at some points they seem super powerful and in others they're completely powerless. Like Cersei and Sprite can't seem to handle a single deviant together and are completely overwhelmed, but at other times they're super OP. And I find it funny they just had to kill fucking Gargamel because he was just way too overpowered. He was the only Eternal capable of killing deviants solo. And for people who aren't meant to interfere in human affairs, they always seem to be interfering with human affairs. And on that note, it is fucking hilarious how they made the only black guy in the movie responsible for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. But I will grant this movie is one of the only live action films I have ever seen to do speed powers well. But this film's biggest sin really is how boring it is. It is so bland and slow, and a slow burn isn't inherently a bad thing. Many of my favourite movies are slow burns, but you have to make that pacing worth it. Fill that runtime with interesting thoughts and ideas, and this movie just has very few of those. Also, this movie feels like a whole extra chore because these characters are reportedly not going to be featured in Avengers Secret Wars, which is telling me that we are never seeing these bastards again, and we are never going to address any of these events again. They are never bringing up Harry Styles again, they will never bring up the Eternals again, and they are never bringing up Black Knight again. But also, I think the tease for Black Knight is so funny because, like, who actually cares? I cannot imagine even the most die-hard Marvel comic fan pogging at this. And for the longest movie in the Multiverse Saga, and it is long, I have the least amount to say about it. It's the one I dreaded rewatching most despite not thinking it was the worst, and it's one I will never see myself revisiting. I know this movie has its fans and it's had some kind of reevaluation, but I just don't get it. It's not for me, so moving on.
I just heard it. I literally just heard it. I heard the whole thing in my trailer, and I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard.
So I didn't see Hawkeye when it came out. I didn't have any great reason not to. I just didn't care too much. I didn't feel like sitting through another TV show, especially one about Hawkeye or Kate Bishop, two characters I've never historically cared much for. But I was actually excited to get to this one on the run through. I'm a big Haley Steinfeld fan and she's great in everything she does. Looking back, Jeremy Renner gave a great performance in Endgame and I heard the show was actually quite pleasant, so I just finished watching this one and man, the first bit we have with grown Kate Bishop where she accidentally destroys a clock tower is so well done. It's very funny and it shows us her abilities whilst also showing us that she isn't entirely confident in them either. I think her arc and characterization is handled so very well in this show. Steinfeld brings a great amount of history to her performance that details a lot of the misery and trauma, but also so much of the quirkiness, the childishness and the vibrancy that contrasts her to Clint Barton. Also, I adore how they handle Clint in this show. He just wants to be with his family after losing them for 5 years. It's the simplest and most empathetic motivation. They introduce Echo in this show, who I know later has her own show and I assume shows up in Daredevil Born Again, and I'm excited to see more of her character. She's a pretty compelling antagonist who's got an empathetic background and obviously isn't evil but still a force to be reckoned with. We also get some extra Yelena scenes, which is always a positive. I didn't know I was going to get that either, so that was like a really nice surprise for me, but I will say the whole misunderstanding between Yelena and Clint was incredibly tedious. It's so obvious she was never going to eventually kill him, so we as the audience are just waiting for that conflict to be resolved, but it does give us plenty of opportunity to build Kate and Yelena's friendship, which I found very enjoyable. And there's a lot to enjoy about this show in general. The Rogers the musical is hilarious, the score for the show is fun and unique, it's very inquisitive and cute. It's not often these movies and shows have memorable scores, but there's a wondrous quality to this one that makes it stand out among its peers. Plus with the additions of the classic Christmas music themes, it really has a unique audio landscape, and I also like just the general Christmas backdrop. It's a very unique setting and gives the whole show a different feel to the usual stuff that's always apparently set during any month between April and July. The show is really funny. There's a little bit about Clint not being able to hear and him and Kate are communicating on the subway. It's a cute scene with some genuinely funny moments. The comedic timing and chemistry between the two leads is some of the best in any of this saga so far. And the whole idea of Clint going deaf brings around a lot of good moments, including this one where he uses Kate as a way to talk to his kid on the phone. It's a beautiful and well done scene. And in general, the character moments are a big highlight in the show, because the action isn't great and a lot of it is a bit weightless, but when you do get to see Hawkeye do Hawkeye shit, it is pretty fun. And seeing Kate Bishop come into her own next to her idol is nicely executed. How her relationship with Clint evolves is super interesting, with him turning from this idealized version of him that she saw in 2012 New York to the real human he's turned out to be. I'm a big fan of how the show is about the consequences of Clint's Ronin era. It's a very interesting moment in his life and MCU history, but it's a time that can't go without repercussions. But I did earnestly feel like the MCU were just gonna sweep that whole arc or whatever, that moment, under the rug, and I'm glad that they didn't. And the show isn't without flaws. Some of the green screening continues to be an issue, but luckily the show doesn't have many big action sequences. They're usually hand-to-hand close quarters on a set, so it works. I think the writing could afford to be more subtle at times, but I think the dialogue is very strong and the character moments are so beautifully done. I don't think there's been any scenes or movies that endear me more towards Clint than this. I think it has some interesting commentary on what it actually takes to be an Avenger, what it really takes to be a superhero. You think it's all glamorous, saving people, looking cool, but a lot of it is being hurt, getting patched up, constantly almost losing your life and being worried and emotionally torn all the time. And this isn't just a commentary for the audience, but for Kate Bishop, who did think it was all glamorous and saving people and looking cool. She's coming to terms with what it actually is to be a superhero, and it puts heavy emphasis on Hawkeye's place on the Avengers team and why he earns that spot just as much as anyone else. Sure, Thor is a god, but with being a god there comes a safety net, omnipotent abilities and a certain level of invincibility. It is far more dangerous and heroic to just be a regular human that is fighting alongside that god, knowing you probably won't make it, but it's your duty to try anyway. I don't think Clint has had better marketing as a hero than this show, honestly. The resolution is nice, it brings Kingpin and his whole world into the fold very nicely and neatly. It presents us with an interesting future for Clint and Kate, not to mention Maya and Yelena, and in the end I really did enjoy this show. I think I like it just as much as Loki season 1, if not just a tiny bit less. It's a very humanizing show for Clint and a brilliant introduction for this universe's Kate Bishop. It has me excited to see more of these characters in the future, if we do actually get to see them in the future. But now we get to move back onto a movie. We have No Way Home, and this one is a major entry in this saga and just the entire universe, because it didn't matter whether you saw this one or not. Everyone had experienced it through some kind of osmosis. All the set leaks and Andrew Garfield interviews, it was impossible to not know everything about this movie before it came out despite Marvel's best efforts. And then once it was out, all the memes, clips and conversations that followed it, it was just everywhere. It was the closest the MCU has come to the cultural phenomenons of Infinity War and Endgame. And the fact that this movie was such an event movie, it suffers from the same issue those other two titans of the MCU did. And that's the moment. Being there and being engulfed, sitting there opening day in the theatre is 50% of this film's enjoyability, which means that when you watch this film out of that context, its quality drops by a whole lot. I saw this in the cinema and then not long after I saw it at home when it dropped on streaming, and let me tell you, I enjoyed it a lot in that theatre room. On my sofa though, not so much. There are so many moments in this movie that are there for crowd reactions, which become awkward to watch when there isn't a crowd. And much of this film's DNA is sold on the surprise and awe of seeing all three of these Spideys and actors together, but once that is worn off and it just becomes a fact of the film, a lot of it became hollow. I told myself I wouldn't watch this movie again because I wanted my last rewatch to be one where I actually liked it and felt if I saw it again, I might not like it at all, and here we are seeing it again. You know, I forgot this film opens with everyone finding out who Spider-Man is, and though I do think it's a very cool idea to start the film off with, I do think a lot of the punch is lost when Jameson never knew Peter. In almost every story where Peter Parker's identity is revealed, Jameson's reaction to that information is always an interesting part of that story, at least to me anyway. But this does give us an opportunity to bring in Matt Murdock and put Pete in a real hot seat. So much about Spider-Man as a character is his pull between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, the responsibilities of both and the struggles of keeping those worlds apart, but this movie puts into perspective how even more challenging life can be when those worlds collide. Then seeing how people who know Spider-Man are punished for just being connected to him. Which also kind of on that topic, it doesn't make sense that Flash got into MIT since he's been parading himself as Pete's bestie, even has a book out about it, but that's a nitpick for sure, it's just something I wanted to mention. What isn't a nitpick though is Doctor Strange's recklessness in this movie. The fact he agreed to cast this spell for Peter is completely uncharacteristic, and it is so unlike Strange that when the movie came out, people were actually theorizing that this wasn't even Stephen Strange. Even the MCU pilled neckbeard spotted how weird of a choice that was and had to make up headcanons just to make it make sense. But I guess without the spell there wouldn't be a movie, so there is that, but it doesn't make it okay. And there's also a couple things that still don't work for me. I still hate the nano suit, it is incredibly ugly. I don't like how the old villains just say classic dialogue from the original movies, it's very cringe and stinks of nostalgia bait. But I do like how the lizard just rants on about wanting to turn people into lizards. It's a good bit and it's childish, but I like it. The green screening is super ugly still, but it's to the point that I think it's just going to be a staple of the saga from now on. But it's so bad at times, they literally CGI green screened Green Goblin's mask in the alleyway. It's beyond unnecessary levels of tampering here. I also hate how Peter's whole plan is just reckless and dumb. The idea of trying to redeem these guys before they go back doesn't change a thing, because if they go back to the moments where they die, it doesn't change if they're good or not, they still die. And I get that he's still a kid, but he's also intelligent, and though recklessness is sometimes a part of his personality, this isn't just reckless, this is idiotic. Because not only will it not work, he is knowingly risking the chance of a multiversal disaster. And let me just say that again, he is knowingly risking the chance of a multiversal disaster. It's completely silly and it doesn't work for me. Also, what doesn't work is that MJ and Ned don't press the button to reverse the spell as soon as they see everything has gone left. Like, I understand the plan was for Pete to text them if something has gone wrong so they can press the button, but they can see on TV that things have clearly gone wrong, and they can safely assume that Pete is not in a position to text them, but things have definitely gone left, therefore press the button. It also doesn't make sense for Flint to turn into a villain for the third act. I think they just wanted him to be an obstacle and add stakes for the third act, but his turn to villainy makes literally no sense. It's like everyone in this movie drops 50 IQ points. I also just really dislike the script for this movie. People just say everything that is happening and everything they're thinking is extremely unsubtle. And if it were not for Willem Dafoe and Alfred Molina bringing a whole other level of class to the dialogue, it would be a whole lot worse of a movie. And really, these actors just slip straight back into these roles, especially Dafoe, who is very easily giving the best performance in the movie, and it's not even close. And along with that, I'll give you some things that I do actually like. I like this small bit of Pete's teachers finding out and talking to him for the first time. It's really funny, especially Hannibal Buress, who believes he's evil. I love this moment where Peter gets his spidey sense for Doc Ock on the bridge. It's the moments like this that give me goosebumps rather than the big reveal moments. And the multiple Peter Parker thing does still really work for me. Seeing all these actors interact does kind of bring me joy, especially during the third act where they all team up and coordinate their attacks. I don't know, man, seeing Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man again just really does endear me to this movie, and I know, it's nostalgia bait. I'm very aware of that, but I'm just not immune to the propaganda sometimes. I also like how all of these villains interact and have different relationships with Peter. Like Sandman in the beginning is completely cool with him because they ended on good terms, although I do find it funny how Flint Marko introduces himself by his full name, despite thinking that this Peter was his Peter, so like why would he do that? Again, the drop in IQ points is so bizarre. I also find it funny how Electro is like cool now. They just completely altered his personality and gave him a better haircut. Aunt May's death is super powerful because she's about the only character done consistently well across these movies, and her death is hard hitting. She delivers a good spin on the responsibility line and it's done very well, though I do think Happy getting arrested during that moment is far beyond unneeded. It distracts from the moment. We should just be soaking in the moment of Aunt May's death. But I do love how in some ways this is Peter's origin movie. He loses his idol, they deliver the responsibility line, nobody knows who he is, he's street level with a homemade suit and he's alone in the world. And it's overall a decent movie. I don't think it's bad, but it's definitely not good. It is relying heavily on the nostalgia to carry it through. Not solely, because there are some genuinely good elements aside from all of that, but I think to someone who has never seen any other Spider-Man movie outside this universe, this won't hit nearly as well. And the final spell to make everyone forget who Peter is just conceptually falls apart if you think about the implications of it for more than 3 seconds. And like the spell, the movie's heart is in the right place, but it's just functionally messy. I don't love it, but I certainly don't dislike it. It's good enough to pass, and it's certainly better than Far From Home. Which brings us back onto a TV show. We have Moon Knight, and this one is particularly special to me because Moon Knight is my second favorite comic book character behind Spider-Man, but the difference here is that Moon Knight has never been adapted before. Spider-Man has a million adaptations, but Moon Knight, this is his debut on the big screen, or little screen, whatever TV is. He's been featured in some animated shows, but he's never had his own. He's been in some video games, but never his own, and he's never been in a movie. So this was a big deal to me, and he was being played by Oscar Isaac, who is a genuinely brilliant actor. So this was kind of a dream to me, and I thought if this show was handled as well as Loki or even Hawkeye, it could be my favorite MCU thing ever. And at the time, I watched it and I was very underwhelmed. It was okay, and I was glad a bunch of people liked it, plus seeing a bunch of the comic book stuff in live action for the first time was cool, but it just fell short of near enough every expectation I had. And honestly, the biggest mistake this show made was being just good enough to convince people to read Moon Knight comics, and then come away from and them being disappointed by the show in retrospect. And you know, I haven't revisited this since. This was the one that killed my love for the MCU. I had lost a lot of faith in them, and this is where the fall off really started for me. But I'm back, and on this time round, I gotta say, I really enjoyed it. There are still some great elements. I mean, having Oscar Isaac as your lead is always going to help, but also having Ethan Hawke as your antagonist, that's a whole other ballgame. Plus, I think this show is a very decent introduction to the character and the mythos of Moon Knight, and being honest, it's not the easiest concept to grasp for an unadjusted audience. The story being generally that war criminal and mercenary Mark Spector is dying next to a statue of Khonshu, the Egyptian moon god, whilst on a mission in Egypt, and Khonshu offers to revive him if he becomes the Fist of Khonshu, his Moon Knight, essentially becoming an avatar for the god. His job and purpose is to be the protector of the travelers of night. He protects the vulnerable and delivers Khonshu's justice. However, the issue with Mark is that he has DID, so he has two personalities, the other being Stephen Grant, and thus we have issues. Now, there's a lot to the character and different iterations have different ideas and such, but I think this show covers a lot of them very well. We get the DID angle and it's handled pretty well actually. I love how in the first episode it's just Stephen flicking in and out of time, not really knowing what's going on. It sets up a very cool mystery in his origin story, and I especially love the decision to start the show off with Stephen as the protagonist, because in reality, Stephen is the added personality, Mark is the original owner of the body. It's a very interesting decision to shoot it from his point of view, using him as an audience surrogate, so as he learns about Mark and Khonshu and all of that stuff, we do at the same pace. It's clever and ensures the audience don't get too overwhelmed by the concept and information too quickly. They also deliver on the idea of Khonshu not being completely altruistic. A big aspect of Moon Knight and his mission for Khonshu is that there's a moral ambiguity to both of them, and this show really delves into that. And on that topic, Khonshu looks absolutely amazing in this show, and the Moon Knight costume is incredible in the way it mixes the practical suits and the CG elements. And they also bring in the white suit and tie outfit, which looks clean as hell, which they also use as a clever way to distinguish between Stephen and Mark, which I thought was cute and a good way to spin that idea. And there's a lot of very nice VFX shots too, like all the reflection stuff they do and all the Egyptian mythology they bring to life. It's a beautiful show, all things considered. Plus, we don't have to deal with any Surf Dracula bullshit. We get Moon Knight in his costume at the end of the first episode. I was fully expecting to have to wait until the final episode for that, but nope. We get it very early on in this show's life, and I greatly appreciate that. I think the show nicely explores the relationship between Mark and Stephen, and their conflict is a great driving force of the narrative that Oscar Isaac makes work in every scene he's in communication with his own performance. It's brilliant writing and acting that I think is easily the highlight of the show. Like when they're going through the afterlife in episode 5 and they sift through Mark's memories and trudge through his trauma, it's genuinely some of the best emotional storytelling this entire saga does. Though I selfishly do wish the show had less Mark and Stephen and more Moon Knight, I can't deny they do actually execute what they're aiming for pretty well. And to finally see Mark's original death and bargain with Khonshu on screen is really cool, I have to admit. They dip into the horror genre a little in episode 4, which I found was a great evolution of tone in the show and made this entire sequence stand out, then diving more into the Egyptian mythology and history, like discovering Alexander the Great's tomb, and becoming a national treasure movie for a moment. It was just really fun, and then using that as a way to leapfrog us into more spiritual territory where Mark explores the afterlife. And I love how this show handles the idea of the afterlife and kind of explains how it all works in this universe. Because the Marvel universe is so rich with mythology, some borrowed, some self-constructed, and dealing with all of that is very difficult, and it deals with how different countries, planets, gods, and faiths all have different ideas, but they're all true. The show essentially says that everyone is right and their afterlife is determined by their particular faith, which is a cop-out answer for sure, but it also is an incredibly respectful one that also makes sense in some ways and manages to neatly tie together all of this mythology within the MCU without any conflict. Also a little tidbit, I just love when his cape does the moon thing. I legit pogface every time I flip to a panel in a comic and it's there, so when I saw it in the show, I got real excited. And little goofy things like where Steven dusts off his jacket when he's fighting Harrow is the kind of corny stuff I come to superhero media for. And I think that's why this show shines. It works perfectly well at being goofy, it does so much mature and emotional stuff well, and it commits very heavily to its aesthetic. It really feels like a comic book adaptation, and though I think it could definitely be stronger, it is in no way perfect, it is quite easily one of the higher quality Marvel things to come out in this saga. And when looking back on it so far, it's quite interesting that TV shows became a big problem for many, including me, but when comparing the quality between the shows and the movies, the shows are far outweighing the movies so far. And just before we move on, I wanted to show you guys my favourite line reading in the entire MCU, which comes from this show.
Stephen, I must
You
be
say that
mistaken.
again. My mother is alive. You say that again, I will freak out, I promise.
I must be a mistake.
Oscar Isaac, the gift that you are.